everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the LEX podcast. LEX is Leaders in Employee Experience, and this is our central platform to bring all the advances we are bringing to the world in the field of employee experience. I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Ali Fenwick. Ali happens to be a great friend, a member of our advisory board, and also someone who's very knowledgeable on behavioral sciences. He's a professor at Hult International Business School, and he's also very popular on TV, gracing various shows and giving his insights, most recently talking a lot about remote working and hybrid working. So we take this as a great opportunity to hear from Ali on all the research that he's been doing in terms of work itself, the changed nature of work, and how the world is coping with all of this kind of massive change that has been thrown our way. But I'm quite sure we will walk out of this change stronger and better than we were before. So, Ali, welcome on the show. Welcome on the first LEX podcast. And we look forward to hearing a lot of insights from you today.
Thank you, Nishi. Thank you, first of all, for that wonderful introduction. And also, thank you for having me on the show. I'm looking forward to having this discussion with you today.
Great. So let's start straight away. The world has changed and the world of work has also changed. So how would you describe the change in the way people work over the course of the last 2 years now?
Oh, great question. So I guess, before the pandemic, let's start there maybe. I think we always were speaking about how volatile and uncertain the world was, right? We used to use the acronym VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. But it wasn't really until the actual pandemic happened that we realized, how rapidly changing this world is and how quickly we need to adapt to our new environment. Now, the pandemic also showed that when push comes to shove, we can actually make those changes. So I think what's very interesting, in one way, the world is changing, the nature of work is rapidly changing, but in some way, our belief systems and our attitudes have held us back a little bit from, kind of progressing as fast enough as the world is changing itself. But there comes the pandemic, and now all of a sudden people had to work from home. And so that's been, of course, a major change, but also I want to be very mindful of the fact that not everyone can work from home. So in today's discussion, I guess we're going to talk about hybrid work and remote work based on your introduction, but also I just want us to stand still a little bit about the majority of people who can't work from home. And that's not only about people that live in third world countries or upcoming countries, let's say, where the infrastructure might not be in place to be able to facilitate working from home, but even in industrial countries like the UK and US and the Netherlands and Europe and Japan, a huge number of people can't work from home because of the nature of their job. So that's also we need to be mindful of, that the pandemic has changed a lot, right? It has changed the way we work, but at the same time, because of the nature of the job, for example, people working in hospitals, working in factories or in stores, they're not able to work from home. So I think that's an important thing to mention before we actually talk a little bit more about, how the world has impacted where and how we work.
Deskless worker is something that is extremely important as a category.
Yeah,
so we end up kind of always talking about people who are sitting at a desk in office and working from 9 to 5.
Yeah.
But a vast majority of people do not perform the desk job. They are deskless. And that's a very important segment to not forget about.
Absolutely. And I think also things might change there, but I guess, focusing on actual desk workers, as you call them, and them actually now, working from home, working in a hybrid setup or working within a remote setup. I think we've learned a lot, right, in the last 2 years, and we're getting better at it. At least many organizations are understanding the benefits to it. And also, in some cases, we also see sometimes that there are some disadvantages to work, remote work and hybrid work, but that has mainly to do with, I believe, how organizations manage a remote workforce. And I think that's one thing that we're going to see that's going to become a much more important topic as we move into the future. The post-pandemic era, hopefully post-pandemic, I don't want to speak too soon, but let's just call it the post-pandemic era for now. We've come to understand that flexible work arrangements in all kinds of forms right now help to facilitate work in a very complex environment. So let's say another unfortunate situation happens again, can we facilitate remote work again? How do we facilitate hybrid work effectively, et cetera? That we can do that right now. So I think this remote work, hybrid work is definitely here to stay. But the question is, how do we make it even better than what we are? Because we were pushed into it. We're getting better at it. Some organizations want to go back to the office, and I guess we'll talk more about that as well. But the most important thing is, how do we move forward with these flexible work arrangements? And how do we do this in a way that is even more effective into the future?
Right. So let's look at this whole concept of hybrid work, which is here to stay based on what we hear. Now, when I look at hybrid work, it is the most difficult form of work. When everyone is in office, it's all okay. It's the same level playing field.
Yeah.
When everyone has the 2x2 space on a Zoom screen, it's fine because everyone has the same space. But then we are talking about a hybrid work environment where some people are at work, some people are not at work, and some people are never at work. They're always working from home. Now, in a situation like this, especially from a cultural point of view, and how do we kind of create that uniform culture and also not fall into the pitfalls of out of sight, out of mind kind of principles? How do you suggest organizations look at the way of working in this kind of a situation where some people are always at work, some people are always at home, and some people come into work 2 days a week or 3 days a week?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I think we can answer, I can answer that question from multiple perspectives, but I like the fact that you mentioned culture, right? I think organizational culture is something that we need to take into consideration if we want to keep on facilitating, flexible work arrangements with, these multiple ways of working, as you mentioned, the hybrid, full-time office, and full-time remote. Culture plays a really strong role, because if we look prior to the pandemic, those companies that naturally had an open work culture where you could work from home, work remotely, mainly the tech companies, you saw that those were the companies that made that transition very quickly, very fast. And they did that very efficiently. And even in many companies like Twitter, for example, they wanted to start, during the pandemic, they started to offer remote work forever to everyone, right? Also great talent management strategy. If you want to find talent, you don't have to look within the 10-50 kilometer radius anymore. You can go across the globe, right? India, China, wherever you can find your talent to come and work for you, because you're not bounded by the physical boundaries of the organization. However, most companies were not at that level where most tech companies were, or in their digitalization, let's say, level, to be able to facilitate that from an infrastructure perspective. But I think most importantly, it was the mindset and the cultural aspect, where you could see differences from one company to another company. So of course, during the pandemic, companies were forced into it, but when it came to a cultural difference, you could see that some companies wanted to facilitate that much more easier, and that transition, of course, with some hiccups from an infrastructural perspective, eventually overcame that, and then eventually continued working from home. And those companies, you saw even now when we're kind of coming out of the pandemic, that those companies wanted to continue offering hybrid work and remote work. And then you have the other companies that are more stuck in their traditional ways, where they feel like what you were saying, out of sight, I don't trust you. So it's that kind of paradigm that, if you don't see your employees, you can't trust them from that perspective. And the moment that something doesn't go well, for example, with the remote work, because hybrid work and remote work, we need to learn how to make that work effectively. But the moment things don't go right, then it's, it comes back onto the management radar saying, look, once we get out of this pandemic, let's try and get people back to the organization ASAP, not from only, let's say, a results perspective, not only saying from, hey, we see some bleeps in collaboration, or we see sometimes it's better to have people work in the office just to have that social connection, but purely from that cultural perspective. And I think that's one thing that we need to be mindful of. If we're entering now this post-pandemic era where hybrid work and remote work is becoming the new norm, culture also needs to change to adapt to that. There's one last thing I just want to mention about that very briefly, that if we take Japan, so we often look at remote work from the Anglo-Saxon perspective, right? Europe, especially UK and the US. I've worked and lived in Japan for many years, and I also wrote a lot about working from home in Japan. Now, from a cultural perspective, right, across the different industries in Japan, working from home is frowned upon in the Japanese business culture. And so when it's frowned upon, people do not feel comfortable to be able to work from home, because, you know, in Japan, this belief is if you're working from home, you're resting. And also because when you're in the office together, people pick up on these social cues. So in Japan, for example, productivity is not always, you know, a key thing that they're looking for. You know, the bosses are actually looking for more busyness. Are you being busy and active in the workplace? But now when you work from home, you can't see each other, and you can't get that kind of feedback, that nonverbal feedback that you're being acknowledged. And I think that also, of course, has had a huge impact on, for example, Japanese organizations, you know, moving to the working from home office setup. And but I think they've moved through that eventually. But a lot of companies would like people to come back into the office again. So not only from a, let's say, from a business culture perspective, but also just sometimes just from a general cultural perspective. You know, working from home is not always seen as something positive, but I think that needs to change also for the future if we want to make these kind of flexible work setups successful.
Sure. You are someone who does hypothesis testing. You are someone who doesn't take something at face value. And unfortunately, the field of HR is full of fads, full of unscientific kind of beliefs. What does research tell us in the last couple of years on what's happening at the workplace?
Well, it depends on what kind of research you're looking at, but I think just kind of bringing it back to maybe hybrid work and remote work. You know, there's been different types of findings in terms of productivity. I think that's maybe a great starting point for this discussion. So, for example, there's research that actually shows that the moment that people started to work from home, that they achieved tremendous productivity gains, right? So there was a lot of productivity increases because of the working from home setups. And then there is other research that then counteracts that research and says, no, you know, working from home to a certain extent was good, but then we're actually now seeing productivity declines. Now, this is all science. This is scientific research. This is not even just kind of people's opinions. So what is actually true here? I think generally when we kind of aggregate a lot of the recent research in the last 2 years, because a lot of research around productivity has been done and well-being of employees working in these flexible work arrangements. I think generally we can say that we do see productivity increases when people have that ability to work from home, but also work from the office at the same time. So hybrid in this sense seems to be, you know, probably one of the most successful setups in that sense for the majority of people. Because for some people, depending on your personality, individual differences, you know, remote could be a little bit better for them or works out better for them, but other people don't, right? Because they do miss that interaction with other people. But the hybrid setup is really interesting because a lot of research is kind of indicating that there are a lot of productivity gains to be achieved when we have a hybrid work setup, but also if there's a good kind of structure in place that facilitates hybrid work. So that's kind of the not the caveat, but that's kind of the sideline that we need to take into consideration. Not just saying hybrid work in itself is great, but understanding that we need to set it up in the right way as well.
Right. So I'm one of those possibly minority who prefers being in office when I have a chance. How do people like me deal with this change where the majority don't agree with me anymore? They would want to work remotely or work sometimes in office.
Yeah.
So what advice do you have for employees and managers who land back in office?
Yeah.
But don't find the rest of their colleagues? What happens?
Great question. And I mean, look, and I think this kind of plays into just briefly what I said before, that, you know, when you think about employees and people in the workplace, where there's no one size fits all. I think something, you know, a very common approach in HR, or a dilemma, has always been, to which extent do we standardize HR policies and where do we differentiate? And the preference has always gone for standardization because of, you know, cost and time efficiencies. But I think now with multiple and flexible work arrangements, but also accommodating to people's individual differences, right? Individual differences, not only in preferences in terms of where they work and how they work, but also maybe the time that they work. You have people that are morning people, people that are evening people. And I think the pandemic has made a lot of people reflect on what they do best. Maybe people have come to realize that They don't always want to work from home or from the office, and they want to find that balance. What's also very interesting, I think a research paper I read from McKinsey about a year ago actually showed that there were even differences, gender differences between men and women, that showed that men actually wanted to go back to the office because they felt because they're not seen, they would be missing out on promotional opportunities. And therefore they didn't want to be too much disconnected from the workplace, the physical workplace. Whereas women, on the other hand, preferred to be working more from home or more remotely because it allowed them to have that work-life balance. So there, again, there's a lot of differences that we can take into consideration, but I think for managers, so that's for the employees, find what works for you. And if your organization works for you, it allows you to do that, that's great. But from a management perspective, I think we need to become much more cognizant of the fact that in these 2 years, people have developed new habits, and they have found what works for them. And I think managers would be wise to think of their workforce or their teams much more as much as possible from an individual perspective. So how can I balance out the individual differences in my team to such an extent that it's possible, but at the same time try to standardize the approaches so that it's manageable, right? So I think it's finding that balance between standardization and differentiation as a manager to work with your teams to create a very effective, just to make sure that you get the best performance out of your team members. So I'm trying to give two perspectives here.
Right. So in this kind of a very difficult kind of a jigsaw puzzle where different sets of people have different needs and different aspirations, what happens to culture? How do you create one unifying culture where different people have different needs and different preferences? And they're not necessarily together in physical proximity.
Yeah. Well, that's a culture is something that doesn't change that easily, right? Especially in an organization. It can take years for organizational change to happen. Organizational cultural change to happen. It often requires a change of top leadership as well, for the culture to change in the organization. However, I think there are ways that we can actually leverage individual differences into a common identity. And I've done research, this as well. I've done research in social identity as a psychological construct that we, as organizations can start using to look at everyone's individual aspects and their own identities that they bring into the workplace, but to start tying them into one kind of identity, the organizational identity that everyone can relate to. Even though everyone is different, what are those commonalities such as values, purpose, direction, vision? Those are all kind of management and leadership tools that you have to your disposal that you can start creating an environment where people feel connected to, even though they're very different. So, topic of diversity and inclusion, for example, is a great topic, because if you as an organization state that you are diverse and inclusive and you practice it, you walk the talk, then people really want to show up because they feel safe and they feel good in your environment. So that's the common identity that the organization has as a culture, but everyone brings in their individual self, as long as they feel it's safe to do so. So I guess thinking about cultural change is very important, especially in today's world, as organizations are changing, the way of work is changing, but that you think of your culture in a way that's conducive to having diverse individuals in your organization, but also diverse ways of working, and that it also is an acceptable thing. Just to your point, if someone feels that, I have to be in the office if I want to get promoted, and then people who don't work in the office, they might feel left out, or they might feel as a secondary employee in the organization. So when you think about that cultural change, how do you embed that mindset into that new cultural aspect that facilitates the change? That's absolutely important. Absolutely. So I agree with you on that one. Yeah.
And how does engagement change when people go through these shifts from working in an office to hybrid to fully remote? Because obviously the stressors are different, productivity blockers are different, your relationships are different depending on what kind of setting you choose. So what does your understanding of engagement say when it comes to the three different categories of people?
Great question. And that's also, that's a topic that I've done research on. and in that space. So first of all, engagement has been a core topic in HR, right, and human resource management. And the idea behind it is that if people are more engaged, they give themselves more, they're more absorbed in their work, they're more emotionally connected to their work, and therefore their productivity is higher, and all the employee outcomes are much more higher. So what the research that I've been working on right now has looked at how do these engagement profiles, if we can call them something like that, how do they differ from, from one work setup to another work setup? And in some recent research that I published for the EWOP, which is the European Association for Work and Organizational Psychology, the research that we submitted there and presented was we showed that actually basically people that work in these different work arrangements actually have different engagement profiles. But what was more interesting in this research that we found was that the performance drivers that HR leaders have, or managers and leaders have in their hands to positively impact performance, had a different effect depending on what kind of work arrangement you have. Fascinating, really, really fascinating. So we looked at constructs such as not only engagement, but we looked at sense of belonging. Because one thing that we also recognized in our research, and also the research that I did that before, during the initial stages of the pandemic, we found that socialization, missing out on that social connection, that was feeling isolated, were things that people were that were actually negatively impacting people's performance, but also missing out on recognition or working with other people. So we actually found that, for example, just to give you one insight here, is that collaboration, for example, has a much more stronger effect on engagement when you're working in a hybrid environment, or when you're, for example, working fully remotely on engagement. But when you're actually working from the office full time, it actually has a much more stronger impact on a sense of belonging than it does on engagement. Fascinating stuff. I mean, I don't think anyone's actually done this kind of research before, and I hope so. I hope they have, because then I'd love to talk to them about these findings. But these are some initial insights about how different work arrangements affect employee psychology differently, and also therefore their performance.
So what I hear from you is that the decades-old definition of engagement that stayed constant all this while needs to be rebuilt, because what was consistently true in that sense is no longer consistently true.
Yeah, let me add to that actually, and that reminds me of something. When I was conceptualizing engagement, how do we measure engagement, right? So normally we use these existing skills of measuring engagement in the workplace. And I think when you look back at the last 10, 15 years, or even 20 years, engagement has always, and this is not just for engagement, this is also for motivation, right? Like intrinsic, extrinsic motivation in the workplace, that has always been constructed or conceptualized as something that happens in a physical workplace where everyone is co-located together. So when we were running this research, we had a dilemma. Either we'd have to change the existing scales, which would therefore, we'd have to revalidate the whole scale set again before we actually continue with the research, or we actually looked for a engagement scale that was not bound, let's say, within the workplace. So I'm not saying I feel fully absorbed when I am at work in the workplace or something like that. So that was very interesting. And I think to your point, we have to probably start thinking of the psychological constructs, motivation and job satisfaction and work commitment, for example, in a way that goes beyond the physical boundaries of the organization, because again, it doesn't fully conceptualize how work is being conducted right now. Excellent point, though.
Thank you, Ali. I think it was an amazing discussion I had with you today, and I'm sure our audience will find a lot of value in this. Reach out to us in case you want to hear more from Ali directly about how you could engage with different advances that we've been making in the field of employee experience, in the field of employee engagement, and overall how we understand working in different work settings, whether it is full-time in office or full-time remote or hybrid. So reach out to us in case you have any questions, and we'll be very happy to get that addressed through Ali. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed this conversation.
And we'll see you in the next session.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.